everybody, and welcome back to the Legal Weekly Wine, where we discuss the week's hottest legal topics. Today, we are discussing Trump's use of executive orders against specific law firms and what that effect has been. Which law firms have caved, which ones are fighting, and what does it mean? How, if at all, will it actually work against other lawyers, work within the legal system? What is the effect that it will have on the entire legal system? That is our topic of discussion today as the hottest legal topic. I'm Virginia Tarani. I'm with Tarani Law LLC, because you never need a lawyer till you do. I'm also the CEO of the Law Unscripted that hosts this program of the Legal Weekly Wine. Today, I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. John Weil, who's the Dean of the Honors College at Middle Tennessee State University. Welcome back.
Good to be here.
And all right, so you and I have already been having quite a few discussions about this topic. So that's a big pause. I'm not sure what to say except everything that I want to say. And I must say that my husband also knows how equally upset and passionate I am about this particular topic. Another pause. Dr. Weil, are you with us?
It might affect your future and that of every lawyer in the United States. How could you be concerned?
Yes, right?
As long as you do what the president wants you to do, you'll be perfectly fine.
Right. What's the problem? We'll all be compliant. We'll all figure it out.
And you might have to, instead of doing pro bono work for people who need it, you might be doing it for the government.
Very well could be. Yes. So, just my future implication, the future against my own future is the implication here. So, it's a huge concern. Definitely cause for a little bit of a happy hour treat. I have today one of my old standbys, Bartonura Moscata d'Asti, one of my favorites here. Beautiful white wine. And Dr. Weil has some Pepsi, brought back one of his solids as well. Cheers. And I'm also using one of our nice wine glasses. I'm with the Gaithersburg Germantown Chamber of Commerce here in Maryland. And each year they put on a wine festival, essentially, a wine tasting. And each year we end up providing glasses for them. And we have our Legal Weekly Wine podcast brought to you by Tarani Law on it. So cheers, everyone. And let's get started on this dangerous and passionate topic. Cheers, Dr. Weil.
Cheers.
All right. So, as a lawyer, you are right. This is extremely near and dear to my heart. And we've seen a lot of executive orders come through the Trump administration this year. We're still in 2025. We're only in March. So have we even reached, I'm trying to even remember what today is that we're taping, the 29th. We have definitely reached past the first 60 days of the presidency, right?
Yes.
And we've had so many executive orders. I'm not sure who's keeping track of them, but somebody far better than I am is keeping track of these. Are we past the hundreds now?
I think so. And again, executive orders are sort of peculiar to begin with. They're a form of sort of executive legislating, and legislative power primarily is vested in Congress.
Right.
First article of the Constitution. And for that matter, I know that you prefer, and we both prefer to stick to legal issues versus political issues, but the same could largely be said about the tariff power.
True.
The power of tariffs is a power of taxation, and that's a power that belongs to Congress. Now, admittedly, Congress has over many years given authorization to the president to adjust tariffs to protect American interests, and particularly in times of war or in matters involving, enemies of the United States. But the power seems to have metastasized, and you would hardly even know that Congress was involved in making tariffs. Right. And they really, this is an area where they need to claw back this power. Not that there should not be some a president ought to be able to respond in a judicious and expeditious fashion
Of course.
when another company imposes, higher tariffs on us. But to declare that we're in a constant state of war simply because there are terrorists somewhere in the world, or something could go wrong, is just to push the boundaries of presidential powers far beyond what the framers intended.
Right. Definitely so. And that's been a consistent theme that we're seeing is at least the last number of weeks we've been talking about the different branches of government, the three that we have, and which powers are vested in each. And what is this balance of power that's shaking up to be this year versus any other year that we've had through the entire over 200, almost 250 years of our nation.
And to be fair, Trump is not the only president who's pushed the boundaries. I was one who was very concerned about the Biden administration's policies regarding student loans. And, as a college professor, if anybody sort of understands the dilemma that students can get in, I certainly do. On the other hand, I thought the president really exceeded what the powers that Congress had given him to forgive loans.
Right.
And, I try to be consistent on these things. But Trump truly has pushed executive power in almost every area far farther than it has ever been before. And if we want a one-man strongman leader, all you have to do is just sit aside and watch. But if you think that powers are better balanced and checked, then now it's the time to act.
Right. And when we're looking at this, I thought you were going to end up saying all we have to do is agree. But you're right. All we have to do is sit back. We don't even have to verbally agree. Is acceptance by lack of opposition, by lack of performance, by lack of verbal or physical action. And in this case, specifically with regard to the law firms, that's kind of what we have, or what I'm thinking that we have. Now, as an attorney, I've spent all attorneys, unless they've done one of those 10-year book learning where I don't even know what you call it anymore, where they
reading law.
Yes, the reading law. Thank you. And it's offered in very few states, if any, anymore. I don't even remember now. I know it was when I was in law school, at least through Virginia. You could work with an attorney for 10 years, and after that 10-year period, apply for your bar, and you could be granted it. But most of us have gone through 4 years of undergraduate education and another 3 full years of law school. In my case, I went through another. I went through the LLM program, which is a master's of law. So I've got even another 8 years invested in my education to become an attorney and to use my degrees in the best way possible. And I am barred in 3 states. I'm barred in Maryland, Virginia, and DC.
Be careful that you explain that. You're not barred from.
Correct.
You're barred in, which means something different.
It is. It's definitely something different.
It could hurt your reputation. He's been barred in 3 states.
I know, it's crazy. So the legal lingo is I'm barred in these jurisdictions, meaning I can practice in these 3 jurisdictions. In most states, you have to take a bar examination, and this is where the term comes from, to be barred in the state. Some have reciprocal laws where if you are barred in one state and apply to another, pay a hefty sum, go through character and fitness requirements, then you can also get their license. DC is famous for that. And I'm going to bring up DC because we're going to be using DC in some of my examples today. So DC is famous for most people, not all attorneys, but most or many of the attorneys who work in DC have other states' examinations. They've taken other states. And all of the federal government, there is no federal bar exam. You use a state bar exam, and then you are licensed to practice. You can do federal court. So you have to get permission to practice in federal courts, but you do not have to take a bar exam for federal courts. So what happens is people take bar exams in other states, then they become reciprocally barred in DC. So if you're practicing in the District of Columbia, you can actually practice with a DC bar license. In the federal government, if I applied under any of my licenses, I could obtain permission to work in a federal court. I have that in Maryland. I'm licensed to practice before the federal bar in Maryland, specifically the Maryland Federal. I think there's actually only one or two locations. Goodness, I can't even remember now. It's been a while since I've practiced in federal court. I'll be honest. It's once you get into the state courts, once you get into actually not practicing as much in the federal government, you get a little bit away from it. But I see that because whatever state you are barred in, you are responsible for complying with their rules of ethics, often called the rules of professional conduct. And it is a very fine line sometimes as to whether you are acting within these rules of professional conduct. I like to think that those who are concerned about it are the attorneys who are the better and more ethical attorneys because they actually care and they actually want to follow the rules. But all of us, I will say almost without doubt, almost every attorney has thought at one point that their stomach is going to fall out of their body or their heart fall out of their chest because did I miss something? Did I do something wrong? And in this particular issue with the lawyers being called out by the Trump administration, I think ethical alarms should be going off in all of these attorneys' heads. That there should be warning flags and bells and everything else crying from the rooftops. And if there isn't, there should be.
So if people see the shelf behind you,
yes,
I believe they will see that I had two early books on this, two sets of books, one called Great American Lawyers,
yes,
published by ABC Clio, and another by Great American Judges. And I did it with just a little hesitation because I'm a professor. I'm not a lawyer. But, and I was interested in sort of seeing who were the best of the best throughout American history. But I really believe that lawyers, like other public servants, like educators, I mean, I have a responsibility to teach responsibly.
Yes.
Air all sides of an issue, try to be fair to students no matter what their political persuasions might be.
Right.
And lawyers have a similar obligation.
Yes.
And historically have been very important. I was reading an article, and actually the law firm, if I remember, that Abe Fortas was a part of during the 1950s when the government was blacklisting people who were homosexuals or communist or had errant views. They stepped in and said, we believe in the United States. Everybody has a right to representation, and they successfully represented many of these people.
Right.
And the law, of course, from a religious standpoint, the law is a high calling.
I believe
it's not just a job. It's something that you're doing, you hopefully to benefit yourself, but also others. And there was an article within the last week talking about part 2, if I remember, of Henry VI, which is one of Shakespeare's plays. And we always quote, first thing we have to do is kill all the lawyers.
Right.
But that quotation comes from a revolutionary who's trying to overthrow the existing British government.
It's not
because he realizes that what stands in the way of order or stands in the way of chaos and lawlessness are people who are willing to defend those on both sides of an issue. And, what's happened here is the president is saying, if your firm supplied a special prosecutor against me, or if your firm has represented this side,
anyone who's against me or on the other side. One of the firms that helped support Hillary Clinton at one point has been targeted.
Exactly. And this is, I mean, it's almost, I don't want to exaggerate, but I don't think I'm exaggerating by much. It's almost like you have a mafia don who's making you an offer that you can't refuse. If you
Yes.
want to appear in federal buildings, why is that up to Trump? If you want to take cases, if
Involving government contracts.
right, if you want government contracts, you cannot represent anyone suing the government. Now, this is from the head of a party that had how many suits?
Yes.
50 or 51 different attempts to overturn the Affordable Care Act.
Mm.
Frivolous suits, many would say, after two or three major Supreme Court decisions that upheld it.
Right.
Trump is now saying if you have a frivolous suit against the government, meaning something against me, you're going to suffer a penalty. And a
Right.
couple of these big firms have buckled under. One is offering to pay 40 or to give $40 million pro bono work to the government.
The other
This is
just
nothing
caved
more than
for 100.
well, it's
It's
from a layman
extortion.
person's standpoint, it's extortion. Now,
Yes.
from a legal standpoint, I don't know if it qualifies as extortion or not, but in the common sense of the term, if you don't do A, we're going to punish you with B. And
Agreed.
this decision is made by one person,
Yes.
and it is scary. And if you
Yes.
don't think it's scary, just change the people. If you
Right.
love Trump, then what would you think if Hillary Clinton did this?
Right.
What would you think if Kamala Harris said, if you've ever supported Donald Trump, you can't appear in a federal building?
Right. You
This
can't
would be
represent
outrageous.
anyone. You have no security. So what he's doing is he's specifically saying he's targeted 5 law firms.
Right.
And he said those particular law firms cannot have he's stripped multiple attorneys, sometimes all of the attorneys, of their security clearances, which means not just that they can't go into federal buildings, but that they can't represent anyone who has potential secure information, confidential information. Right. So they can no longer represent how many of their clients or potential clients, not even who are necessarily involved in government contracts or government cases, but who would have to reveal government confidences. So he's going to strip them of their clients, strip them of their potential clientele, their livelihood, because they previously represented someone who was opposed to him, or because they represented something or a case that was opposed to him or his views or his ideologies. And I've never seen, Dr. Weil, I do want to ask this. I know I've only been on this earth 44 years. And I know I haven't paid as much attention as I probably should have to politics, at least the first number of years. But I have never known, and I don't recall or remember seeing any executive order that has ever specifically named one person or one firm. And in this case, legally speaking, a firm, a corporation, a business operates as a person under the law.
And the purpose of this law is not just to quiet these 5 firms, it's to quiet everybody.
It's the chilling effect.
And for those who are interested, I'm always pushing my stuff, but why not, right?
Well, it applies.
We've talked about the First Amendment encyclopedia that I help edit and contribute to. And you can go to just put in First Amendment Encyclopedia. It'll take you to our university's website at MTSU. And I have an article in there, which I got some help with, by the way, Trump's executive orders against law firms. And it details, so if you want a precedent, they're probably the best precedent that I can find. That's not a presidential order. But in the 1950s, the state of Alabama, in a case that became known as NAACP versus Button, if I remember correct, 1963 case, the state of Virginia adopted a law where you're certified now.
I am, yes.
Adopted a law, and if I remember, the term was barratry. And it was basically a law designed to squelch people who were suing the government. In this case, they were suing on behalf of the NAACP, whom Virginia considered to be communist. And so they adopted a law. And when it got to the Supreme Court said people have a right to counsel. Uh, this is not something that is constitutional. And by the way, it also affects freedom of association.
Correct.
You have a right to choose your clients, and I'm sure there have probably been some clients that you've turned down.
Absolutely.
Don't think your case is strong enough, or I really don't believe you ought to be doing this in this circumstance.
Correct.
This turns all of this on its head.
Yes.
But you're right. This is sort of this issue squared because you have one person making the decision. This is who we're going to withhold funds from. These are the people that we're going to limit access to.
Right.
If we didn't, the right to an attorney, it's a Sixth Amendment right rather than a First Amendment right. But your First Amendment rights are going to be at issue. Any other rights are going to be at issue if somebody can preclude representation on the part of these law firms.
Absolutely.
And as I mentioned, there was a firm in the 1950s that said, we don't care who you are. If you're fighting for your beliefs, we're going to support you. And every time, we have something similar in education right now. You have educational institutions being told,
yes,
if you don't do this, if you don't do that, we're going to withdraw
get rid
your
of
funding.
your DEI programs, if you don't cough up these alleged Palestinian protesters or pro-Palestine protesters,
right?
If you don't do that, I'm going to go back to your word of extortion. In my world, as a lawyer, I'm a former prosecutor, a continuing criminal defense attorney, and this is blatant extortion, which is a crime. And extortion, I'm going to, the federal rule, 18 USC section 873 talks about blackmail and extortion. Now, technically, they're a little bit different. They're lumped under the same category, but they are different. Blackmail usually is specifically referencing secrets or criminal behavior that would be coming out, that they're going to extort you for money or something of value in exchange for them keeping secret.
Like the sextortion cases that have been in the news, right?
Absolutely.
We have nude pictures of you, and if you don't pay us so much, we're going to show them to the world.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a classic one, is in the criminal world, of the legal world, is these exactly the sexting, the sexting, and in the federal statute, it's a crime to use threats or extortion. Now, I know I hate it when it's like synonyms, it is extortion, but what is extortion? Essentially, threats to persuade another to provide you as yourself or a company, right, with benefits, or to compel them to behave in a specific manner. And it's usually through threats of actual or potential harm. So this is with the mafia. I'm going to use yours. They're breaking your legs. What are you going to say? Of course, I'll give you, whatever I have in my cash drawer. Yes, I'll continue to, look the other way for your criminals when they come in. This is classic extortion by what we would think of as mob bosses.
So I can't remember if we've discussed plea bargaining.
A little bit.
I think you've engaged in some plea bargaining, right?
Absolutely.
Most lawyers do.
Yes.
If they're dealing with criminal defendants. There are actually limits to what you can offer and what you can't offer in a plea bargain, right?
Yes.
Because some offers would be such that you literally could not refuse.
Right.
or it would be
and there are times where a lot of the defense bar says, you're bullying us.
Right.
Into a corner, and the prosecutors will say, well, you can take it or leave it. You can go to trial if you don't like my deal. But that's not necessarily illegal.
Right.
It becomes illegal when it's outside of the courtroom. Now, I'm not saying it's good practice, and I'm not saying it gives you a good reputation or should be done. There's the ethical balance to it. But in these particular cases, I'm going to even read the one for Maryland. So let's even get into a different state. Let's get into state law, right? Maryland, their extortion rule says a person may not attempt to obtain, or conspire to obtain money, property, labor, services, or anything of value from another person without or with the person's consent, if consent is induced by wrongful use of actual or threatened force or violence, economic injury, destruction, etc., of any immigration or government identification documents, notification to law enforcement about undocumented or illegal immigration status, or property or labor. And then it even gets into reputation as a portion of this. And to me, what else are we doing but saying, and let's name these 5 firms. The 5 firms that are specifically
now not all have
listed.
capitulated. Let's be
Correct.
clear on that. And 3,
No.
I believe, are actually suing
Correct.
the government, on the basis of the arguments that we've made. But
Correct.
yes.
5 have been named in the executive orders. That's Perkins Coie, Jenner and Block, Wilmer Hale. Those 3 are fighting it. Then we've got Paul Weiss and Skadden Arps have what I would call folded.
And the one has folded, to go back to your definition, one has said, we will provide $40 million worth of pro bono services for the government.
Yes. For Trump and his administration.
Right.
Even after the end of the administration.
Yeah.
And now let me make one clarification. I apologize. I misstepped. Those are the 5 firms at issue. 4 have been named. Skadden has not yet been named. It was preemptively making what the president called an agreement, a settlement agreement, before they could be named by the president. So they went to the president before they were named, or Trump went to them and said, we're about to name you. What do you want to do about it?
And by the way, this resembles something that happened in Trump's first term that got him impeached. Now, it didn't get him convicted, but you'll remember the first impeachment largely had to do with the conversation that he had with Zelensky
in
Ukraine, in which essentially Trump said, if you want X from us, you have to begin prosecuting or investigating Hunter Biden.
Right.
It was a quid pro quo that had nothing to do, ostensibly, with American interest or American foreign policy.
Right.
Trump has told Christian groups he is going to be their vengeance.
Something to that effect.
I may not be using that may be a different related term, but this seems to be very personal.
Extremely so.
And it seems to be attacking not only the right to counsel, but it seems based on the positions that these people have taken.
Yes.
Your firm took a position against Trump, so now you're in the hot seat.
Right.
This is the kind of thing that you see in totalitarian nations.
Yes.
And I don't know when we're going to get to it today, but we're also going to be talking about citizens, people in the United States who are here legally but are not citizens, who are being rounded up simply on the basis, not on the basis of any perceivable national security threat other than they have supported Hamas, supposedly, or they have written an article supporting the Palestinians. Or in one case, a poor woman who I don't know if we'll get to or not, but there's a researcher at Harvard who made a mistake. She came into the country with frog embryos for a professor there, and it turns out she didn't declare it and was supposed to. But they're threatening to send her back to Russia, where she had to leave because she had criticized Russia for invading Ukraine. Right. If we start rounding up people who support Ukraine, I'm going to be among them.
Right.
And I would
Aren't many of
imagine that a
us.
good number of people watching are going to be among them too.
Right. Yeah. And that's key here is in fundamental to law is the right and the ability to argue either side.
Absolutely.
All of us in law school went through. Now you can't be the side you want to be. You have to argue for the other side. And in all of our ethics, rules of ethics, you have the right to. You have the right to argue as long as it's legal, as long as it's not frivolous, and as long as you're not supporting a fraud, and as long as you're not supporting known testimony that is perjurous. Right. But we represent murderers. Lawyers represent rapists. Murders represent asylum seekers.
You represent people accused of murder.
Correct.
And accused of rape. When you represent them, yeah.
Many attorneys represent those who are convicted, right?
Well, that's true.
Who are, yes, at the time that you're there, you're representing those presumed innocent. But even those who are found guilty, how many of us, I'm not saying that I have, but I've prosecuted murders. I've prosecuted rape cases. I've prosecuted gang, drug, and guns. I represented someone accused of rape. I've represented numerous people for drug cases and other felonies. And not because I like them or because I necessarily believe that they are innocent, but because that's the law, that they have a right to a defense, a zealous defense. And if I can only pick and choose my clients based on who I fully and firmly always agree with, then I'm doing everyone a disservice. And why did I become a lawyer? There has to be two sides. And if we eliminate a side, what do we have in the law? And what's the use of any of us?
To go back to what I said earlier in a different way, if Hillary Clinton or Kamala Harris were president, would you want them deciding whether as an attorney you can go into a federal building?
Right. Based on whether you supported Trump.
Right.
Yeah, if Biden had won, or Kamala Harris in this case, if she had won and decided that all of Trump's prior attorneys, she's going to name them, she's going to name their law offices, their firms, them as individuals if she has to, that they are no longer allowed to go into federal buildings, that they cannot represent anyone with federal contracts, that they cannot represent anyone who has secured classified information. Everyone would be screaming. Why aren't we screaming now? I don't care which side it is. Right. And and another person asked me, well, what do you care? You're not a big law firm. No, I'm not. You're right. I'm not. But let's replace it. Let's take out Perkins and Coie and say Tarani Law. What's to prevent it? No, I didn't represent anyone on any side of the political anything, right? My practice is a fairly niche practice at this point. But what's to prevent once one law firm caves, there's going to be an excuse to tag another law firm and another law firm.
They came after the socialists.
Yes.
And I was not a socialist. They came after, and so I didn't say anything. They came after the communists, and I wasn't a communist, so I didn't say anything. They came after the homosexuals, and I was straight, so I didn't say anything. Right. And then they came after me, and there was no one left. That's, a rephrasing of a prominent German theologian during World War II who was in Germany.
Yeah.
These rights are a bundle of sticks that together they compose the American legal system.
Right.
And that system is as good, I think, as any in the world.
And I like your reference back to Shakespeare is get rid of all the lawyers. It's not a funny phrase. It's not a joke. It's so that there's no one to oppose us.
That's right. That's right. And so let's expand this to there's a similar development in at least two other areas. One which we've already mentioned briefly. One is our resident aliens who have a legal right to be here. And another, which I don't know if we'll get to or not, but is a development that's happening in regard to some cultural institutions, most
Yes.
notably the Kennedy Center and the Smithsonian Institution.
Correct.
And we have something, we have, you know, Trump has talked about the weaponization of the law,
Yes.
which to him means his two impeachments were illegal. Well, neither was illegal.
Well, and it
And in my
also means
judgment,
anyone who went against him or put him on trial or sued
right.
him. Anyone.
But
It's not the weaponization in general, it's against him.
right. So now he's doing exactly what he is accusing his opponents of doing. He's trying to weaponize the law.
What else
And
is he doing but in theory, not actuality, but in theory, he's holding a gun to their heads?
right.
He's going to destroy lives and careers and reputations.
So in the same First Amendment encyclopedia, if people are interested, I have an article on Mahmoud Khalil, Kahlil, a student at Columbia University, who had been a very prominent in the movement at Columbia
Yes.
to divest the institution's funds from Israel. I happen to be, well, this is not a movement that I favor myself, divestiture. I don't think it's particularly
Right.
appropriate in this case, but he has a legal right to do it. And he is taken to, first to New Jersey
Yes.
and then to Texas on the basis that I believe under the Alien Enemies Act. Am I right? I think we discussed
I
this
don't
maybe.
know that I know the Venezuelans were used for that, but I don't believe that act
Well,
was
I
actually
believe you're right. I
credited
believe
for
right.
his
He's basically
transfer.
been declared a threat to the United
Security.
States, right?
Correct. A
Right.
national security threat.
Immigration Nationality Act, an alien whose presence or activities in the United States the Secretary of State has reasonable grounds to believe would have a potentially serious adverse policy consequences is deportable. He's picked up in Columbia University, hauled down to Louisiana for a political view, political
Yes.
expression. And frankly, even more shocking is the case in Tufts University outside Boston. I'm probably getting her name wrong. Rumisna Ozturk. And it's pretty shocking.
Yes.
You see a picture of a lone woman, 20, I think in her 20s,
Who
who
appears to
is
be
suddenly surrounded
kidnapped.
by people wearing masks, taken away, and also ends up in Louisiana. And the only known offense is that a year ago, March of 2024, she co-authored an article in the student newspaper at Tufts, basically also advocating for divestiture. So they are now saying that on the basis of that, she is a friend of Hamas, which is an enemy of the United States, and she should be deported. There is, I should mention, yet a third example of a Harvard, well, I mentioned already, right? The
Yes.
Harvard
The
researcher
frogs.
who is again picked up. And, you don't have to approve of these people's political views.
Absolutely not.
But to say, if it can, again, these are the communists and the socialists, to go back to my example.
Right.
These are the people that it's hard to identify with because, probably most of us don't support Hamas or anything associated with it.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make any difference. If they can be deported, any non-citizen can be deported. And if non-citizens can be deported, how far away is it going to be before the rest of us are also subject to suspicion?
Right.
Whatever.
I mean,
This is,
honestly, the Jews were considered national security threats in Germany.
well, yes.
Right?
That we have historical memory to know where these kind of activities lead.
Yes.
And what's very fascinating, Chief Justice Roberts, 3 or 4 weeks ago,
Yes.
Came out with a statement. He didn't mention Trump by name, as I recall, but basically said, these attacks on the judiciary have got to stop.
Right.
The rule of law requires adherence to court decisions. And then the last couple of days, Justice Sotomayor has said something similar. And I would say to date, most of the lower federal judges seem to have, and actually they seem to be fairly discreet. Sometimes they'll say, well, we're not going to give a temporary restraining order till we know more, but they have accepted these cases. And in most cases, they appear to be ruling against Trump.
Yes.
Not against Trump as a person,
but against the claims that he's making through his administration.
These excessive claims of executive authority that frankly, again, if you're not scared by them, put somebody else's,
put another name.
If Biden said this, I would be just as strongly against Biden as I am against what Trump is doing.
Absolutely. Anyone who's going to try to impeach all the judges that make rulings against them, doesn't matter what party. I would love to get rid of every judge that disagrees with me. I would love to get rid of everyone who disagrees with any of my clients, whatever type of case that I have, but that's not how it works. Just because they have a different opinion, and that's the other part, is there should be a majority opinion when it comes to constitutional policies and constitutional law. And that's why we have the Supreme Court as the ultimate decision maker, however you want to say it, the more proper term.
And the court has been, I would say, more than fair to Trump.
Yes.
Particularly in Trump versus United States, where, in my judgment, they gave far greater immunity than our Constitution intended. Our framers said, no man, no person is above the law. And in my judgment, Trump versus U.S. makes it very hard to prove that someone has acted against the law.
Right.
But again, you can't go around praising the Supreme Court for giving you immunity and then saying,
and not
heads I
obeying their
win,
next
tails
order.
you lose.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. And for these particular issues, we look at least one judge has put a temporary restraining order against the actions against, I believe it's Perkins Coie, that law firm. And that judge said something to the effect of, this sends chills down my spine.
And, this is a vital, to go back to the First Amendment Encyclopedia, this is one of the vital principles of First Amendment law, is that actions that in and of themselves you might get by with can have a chilling effect on other people's, if you can, frankly, if you can take some of the top law firms and get them on their knees, then you're going to be able to do the same with anybody else.
What do the rest of us do?
Right.
It is, Skadden Arps, who's agreed to do $100 million in pro bono service. You can call it whatever you want, but that's $100 million. Is it
100 or 40? Or there's
40 was the first one.
Okay.
That was the first one that folded. And then Skadden Arps, before there could be an executive order, the price went up and they settled for $100 million pro bono hours.
And frankly, and there have been some members, at least one member that I know of one of these firms that resigned.
Correct.
And that's what needs, don't use the services of one of these firms until they get this right.
Right.
If they're willing to give up a basic right of representation, you probably don't want them representing you.
Right.
Not that many of our viewers are going to be probably affording them anyway. But
no, of course. But
a real concern.
And that gets to me too. And that's where I'm going to bring it into these ethical conflicts.
Sure.
So when we go to, now I mentioned the DC bar earlier, and I'm bringing it back circle. When we go to DC lawyers or New York lawyers, right? A lot of these firms have offices in both. The biggest firms often do. It's often DC, New York, and then multiple other states, right? They extend their reaches. They extend their offices. But if they're performing in DC, which many of these are, if not all of them, and they need to in order to represent Trump at all, they are subject to the DC rules of professional conduct. And for these, Rule 1.7, conflict of interest. This is specifically that it talks about a lawyer shall not do the following because it would be a conflict of interest. And this is a shall not. It's not saying it's illegal, it's saying it's unethical. And if you violate an ethics rule, you could have a bar complaint. And depending on the seriousness of the ethics complaint and the type of behavior, you could be disbarred as an attorney from that jurisdiction. And in this, here's where I go. For 1.7b4, you cannot represent a client if the lawyer's professional judgment on behalf of the client will be or reasonably may be adversely affected by the lawyer's responsibilities to or interests in a third party or the lawyer's own financial, business, property, or personal interests. And it continues. So it's this. If they're going to take a client or refuse a client because of these, if they're going to be adversely affected, if they're going to be pressured into saying something or doing something that they don't agree with, there's another, the other one that I think applies to this is scope of representation, where it talks about you can work on opposite sides in the sense that you can represent a client whose ideas you don't necessarily agree with, but, and it says specifically, a lawyer's representation of a client, including representation by appointment, does not constitute an endorsement of the client's political, economic, social, or moral views or activities.
Right.
Okay, fine. So they can represent Trump if they want to, even if they don't agree with Trump, just as they could have for Hillary Clinton or
But
Jack
they have the right to
Smith.
charge him, too.
Yes, they have the right to bill. But they also cannot counsel, engage, or assist in conduct with a client or on behalf of a client that is criminal or fraudulent or that may be. And if there's any point, whatever, in this type of situation, call it Trump, call it Biden, call it Mr. Smith's representation, where Mr. Smith extorts you into representing him, fine, I can represent you, whatever. But then later on, Mr. Smith says, well, you owe me $40 million of free services, $40 million of services. That's a benefit he's receiving. And what's to prevent Mr. Smith from saying, so you have to argue this. You have to do this for me. That's illegal or fraudulent or frivolous.
So I'm going to bring up something that doesn't quite legally fit, but it's maybe a good analogy. So the Constitution prohibits what are known as ex post facto laws.
Yes.
They're tricky. They basically deal with criminal law, and that's why it may or may not completely fit here. But an ex post facto law says that something I did yesterday, let's say giving a lecture to honor students, is now illegal, and we're going to punish you for what you did yesterday. That's called an ex post facto law, and it's illegal.
Right.
Well, that's essentially what's happening here. Firms had the legal right to provide Robert Mueller to serve as a prosecutor against Donald Trump. And now they're going to be punished for something that they did, when they did it was legal, that is now considered to be improper.
Correct.
And that applies to almost all of these groups that are being targeted.
Yes.
They have every right to sue the government. And Republicans have every right to sue the government, which they did with Obamacare and with the student loans.
Correct.
The cases that I actually favored, that I didn't think Biden had the authority that he was exercising there. You can't go back and say, well, and same with DEI.
Yes.
Right? So universities were encouraged and others were encouraged, businesses were encouraged,
for
diversity,
years.
equity, inclusion. And now we're going to punish you because you followed a former policy of the government.
Yes.
People ought to be able to see where that goes. That
Right.
means if Hillary Clinton is elected next or Kamala Harris is the next election, she can say, we're going to penalize you if you
If
eliminated
you
DEI.
didn't do DEI,
We're
exactly.
going to be in a vice here. And
And
this is
the
this is not where we
DEI,
want to go.
no, and the DEI rules, that's part of these agreements with the law firms, is
Absolutely.
that the law
And
firms will
again,
get rid of their DEI programs or hiring
right.
practices.
And if that's the people's will and it's not illegal, I'm not necessarily opposed to eliminating, particularly some of the more blatant forms of DEI, but it wasn't criminal.
No,
And that's essentially you're criminalizing it. And let's go. Can we go and talk about the Smithsonian a little bit?
absolutely. I think it fits in
Because
right here.
if there is any institution, well, I'm sure there are others, but it's a great place. Multiple
Cultural,
museums, funded initially by a gift from a British citizen to bring culture to the United States,
culture
the
and the
Aerospace
arts and
Museum.
science and
And
tech and history.
absolutely. I mean, and they're free if I remember. You can
Yes.
take school groups to Washington D.C. to see the Smithsonian Institution. You see the dresses that ladies have worn, to the inaugurations. You can see aerospace. You can see fossils.
Yes.
Example, you've Mr. Jefferson's desk on which he wrote the Declaration of Independence, if I remember, was a highlight of one of my trips. And we're now that President Trump is now saying, we're going to whitewash. We're going to take American history. There's some disturbing things there. People were held as slaves. Well, that didn't make
Yes.
us look good.
No, it
Women
doesn't.
didn't always have the right to vote. Well, they may think that does make us look good. I don't know.
Right.
But,
Native Americans were oppressed. Let's take out the
it would
Native
be like
American
saying,
Museum.
okay, as one who reveres the Bible and preaches from it even,
Yes.
there are a lot of disturbing things in the Bible. The
We
greatest
don't
king,
agree with it.
all right, the
Hmm.
greatest king, King David,
Yes.
commits adultery and then basically has her husband
Killed.
executed. It's a little more indirect, and it's in the Bible. There's a story of a rape in the Bible. There's stories of crucifixions. I mean, there are all
Right.
kinds of ugly things, but we don't erase it. We learn from them.
Well, what goes next? The Holocaust Museum?
Well, sure. Yeah, I mean, there's some very disturbing things in the Holocaust Museum. But we have chosen as a people to recognize that our history, if we have this view of history that America is always right, we're going to be wrong
Yes.
because it hasn't always been right. And there have been great people.
Yes.
I think American history is as great as, the history of any nation in the world.
Anyone
But,
who knows you would say that.
well, I dress up as James Madison. I mean, yes.
You have studied the Constitution, the framing of the Constitution, the framers of the Constitution, the Constitutional Convention, the amendments, the symbols of America.
Right. But to go in and apparently, and actually, I would invite, some of your listeners are presumably close to DC. Go
Yes.
in and look at, and what is it? National Museum of African American History and
Yes.
Culture. It's one of the most recent additions to the Smithsonian. It's a great museum.
It's
Now,
wonderful.
are you going to see that people were lynched? Yes.
Yes.
Are you going to see that people were discriminated against? Absolutely.
Yes.
This doesn't diminish, in my judgment, it shows all the obstacles that we've been able to overcome as we've moved toward greater equity,
Greater democracy.
greater equality among citizens.
Exactly.
And, it would be laughable to have a museum of African American history. I mean, where are we going to start? When? I mean, they were enslaved to 1865.
Right. And even after that, they were
Then you
oppressed.
segregationists to 1954 and a decade or two afterward.
Then
This is
Martin Luther
part of the
King Jr.
story.
was killed. Yes.
Yeah,
I wouldn't want the struggle for women's rights to be eradicated either.
of course
They're
not.
heroes among
And the same
all
with
of
with
these.
immigration. How many how many people came to the United States in search of a better life? And
Yes.
a lot of them, they were discriminated against.
Yes.
Protestants didn't particularly like the Irish and the Italians,
Right.
people coming from Southern Europe. But today, we consider them a vital part of our heritage. We don't need to run away from facts. And, does somebody, can you find a posting somewhere that somebody sent into the Smithsonian that says, America ought to go to hell because of all these wrongs? Of course you can.
Yes.
But that's, we need to present both sides, let people
Right.
express themselves, or, if we don't understand both the good and the bad and the ugly, we're not going to understand where we are right now or where we're headed in the future.
Right. And I agree with that completely. And even back to incorporating the lawyer part, in being a lawyer, having the ability to argue both sides. Where do lawyers go? What do we even do if that is eliminated through judges? If that is eliminated through the professionals? If we all represent the same people and the same sides, and there's only Republican judges who support Trump, and there's only Republican lawyers who support Trump, there's no jobs even for them if everyone always has the same side for the rest of it, as if we completely eliminate the opposite side.
Well, and again, it's not just Trump. The same thing would be true if it were Biden or
Absolutely.
Obama or
If we
Bush or
only have
anybody else.
Democrats
Yeah,
on one side and it's all Democrat judges,
right.
if it's all Democratic lawyers and we're just going to swap sides every 4 to 8 years or whenever the next person comes into power, is if we only have one side, we've eliminated our profession. We've eliminated the entire judicial system because there is no judicial, there's a mob. There's a mob rule if there's no opposition, if there's no effective opposition. If we're only thinking of the opposition, how can we work in it at all? So in my mind, this is an extensive forecasting of let's look beyond 5 names. Let's look beyond 2 to 5 judges. Let's look beyond the current Congress and the current president and say, do we have the ability to choose sides? And hasn't that been what we've praised in democracy?
Right. The Bill of Rights only works if you can. It's not just something. They're not just fancy words on the page. If somebody deprives me of my freedom of religion, I have the right to go to court to challenge that. And if somebody says, well, any challenges against the government, we're not, you can't challenge the government, that means the government can take away my right to religion,
Right.
or speech, or assembly, or press. It means they can break into my house without a warrant and nothing will be done about it. These rights, as we said earlier, they're interrelated.
Yes.
They don't have to, the rights for people that we disagree with are
Just
important
as
in
important.
upholding our own rights and vice versa.
Absolutely. And I'll tell one of my favorite, tell about one of my favorite attorneys, is a hero to me. And he came to William and Mary School of Law while I was there, and he gave a speech, and everyone wanted to see it. Everyone wanted to be there because he was a black man who had represented the Ku Klux Klan in a case where they were asking that they could burn crosses on lawns. And a black man, the Ku Klux Klan is against blacks and blacks, African Americans, gays, anyone essentially who's not Jews, anyone who's non-white Christian. And this black man who they target, in essence, chose to represent them and argue for their right to burn crosses. And he won. He won. That's a hero.
Is this the Virginia versus Black case?
Yes.
Yeah. The
It
Supreme
is.
Court case that it didn't. Yeah, it probably was a victory for what he wanted. It didn't say there was never an occasion.
Correct.
If you burn a cross in somebody else's yard,
There are
you're
limits to
probably
it.
right,
There are
or you're
absolute
doing it
limits to it.
right. If you're doing it for the purpose of intimidating an
Correct.
individual, you can't do it. But if you're having a rally out in the middle of nowhere and you want to blow off some steam and burn a cross, and you're not threatening a forest fire or something like that, then you
Right.
probably had the right to do it. And
Right.
you're right. It's hard. ACLU came in for great criticism over something very similar, which was trying to fight for the right of an organization of Nazis to have a parade in
Right.
a neighborhood where there were a lot of Jews, and this was
Right.
very concerning to people. It upset people, but if they don't have the right, then you may not have the right
Exactly.
to have a demonstration on the other side. So
Exactly. It
the
affects
law, there's a
everyone's
certain
rights.
unity in the law. Yeah.
Yeah. So think about it. We just ask for people to think about it and not just think about it, act on whatever side it is. You can disagree with us. Good. We want people to disagree with us. That's the whole purpose and point of this podcast. I may not like what you say. As long as it's respectful, I'm going to respect what you say, because that's the whole point. Is there are opposite sides. There are differences of opinion. We have the right to that because we're America and we've embraced that. And I hate to see that given away or left behind or taken away. And I urge other attorneys to think the same.
And if you go back to the founding fathers, did a great job in my judgment in the Constitution. There's some
Yes.
things that I think they were probably mistaken about, but what was the first additions they made to the Constitution? They were the first 10 amendments, the Bill of
Yes.
Rights, and it wasn't
Yes.
even, frankly, the main proponent, James Madison, didn't really think they were necessary
That people
because
would just do it.
he thought he had constructed and others had constructed a government that would prevent. But it was like, if people are concerned that their freedom of speech and religion and right to security and whatever is threatened, what harm can it do?
Right.
And Mr. Jefferson was one who said, if we have a Bill of Rights, this gives the opportunity to people whose rights have been taken away to go to courts and get a fair hearing so their rights are vindicated.
Right.
And we should care no less, the threats they face to the Bill of Rights are nothing, in my judgment, compared to what we are facing right now. And they went out and amended the Constitution, frankly, before it needed to be amended,
Right.
just in case. And right now we face a situation, in my judgment, where these basic rights are under absolute threat. And,
I agree.
we need to be awake.
Agreed. All right. So, like,
It's a very
subscribe, and
uplifting
comments,
program, isn't
right?
it?
I've at some points felt like breaking down in tears. Glug,
Okay,
glug.
but the good news is that Americans have risen up.
Yes.
We had 250 years of rising up, particularly against executive authority that is overwrought.
Yes.
And we've had times where we've backslidden, most notably during the Wilson administration in World War I, but we sort of snapped back. And, we need to snap back again.
Right.
And again, we rightfully criticized, I think, the two firms that seem to have caved, but there are others that have not caved.
Good for them.
And there are a lot of attorneys who are stepping, it's not terribly probably popular to defend somebody who is indirect, who your opponents say is connected to Hamas.
Right.
I don't believe these people are. Well, there's one I think that may have been, but
we don't
in
know.
any case, we don't, right. There's nobody who probably favors keeping, what's the name, the group, the Argentinian gang members in the United States. But let's be sure that before we deport them, we know that that's who they are. It might be a brother or sister or a relative of our own, who, tattoo is mistaken for somebody else's tattoos. If
Right.
we start going around examining everybody's tattoos, we're going to be in trouble in
I'm
this
in
country.
trouble.
Yeah. Anyway,
I don't
don't
think
tell me.
you are.
Don't want to know. I hear nothing.
Yeah, I always thought on a lighter, funnier side for all of our true crime addicts out there, I'm a twin. So Dr. Vile's my dad, and my sister. He had me, Virginia and Rebecca. And one of the things we've always dealt with clearly is identity, right? How can you tell one from the other? And through childhood, we would do our hair in different ways. Mine would be short while hers would be long. We'd cross it on the one side versus the other. I had a birthmark on one of my legs and she didn't. So it's always this, how do you tell one from the other? And especially if you're identical and your DNA's the same. And I always chuckle when I tell my husband, well, if we die, at least we'll know it's me because of my tattoos. And he's like that's the only way we would know it's you. And it's like, well, at least someone would be able to identify my body correctly. So, that's why I got some.
By the way, I highly recommend, as a longtime Vera.
The British Mystery.
The British Mystery. There's a new one called Ludwig.
Okay.
Which I highly recommend.
I've missed that so far, but I will watch it. The one I'm going to recommend right now is the new Netflix murder mystery, The Residence. I love it. It is making me happy. It makes me smile. It makes me laugh. So one of the top shows right now on Netflix, and for mystery fans, highly recommend. All right. On that note, we will let you go. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment, and go to www.thelawunscripted.com to find our merchandise, to find this podcast, to find our other The Law Unscripted, as well as our bar review and law school review materials for the 8 core subjects, including constitutional law. So if you want to hear more from us about that, check those programs out, and we will catch you next time on the Legal Weekly Wine.